John Adams was born on the 30th of October, 1735, in Braintree, Massachusetts. John Adams Sr. was a farmer, shoemaker, and a deacon in a congregational church. The family were solidly middle class. There is an interesting story about the young Adams and his attendance at school. The young Adams would bring his firearm to school in case he wanted to hunt on his way home. How times have changed. The young Adams would receive his formal education from Harvard and obtain his bachelor's in 1755. He taught school for a few years while he decided what he wanted to do. He did feel guilty, however, about not getting involved in the French and Indian War. He was the only one in his family not to serve in the militia. His father wanted him to become a minister, but the young Adams decided he was going to become a lawyer. In 1756, he would read law in a small town outside of Boston. In 1758, he would obtain a master's degree from Harvard, and in 1759, he would be admitted to the bar. In 1759, he would meet 15-year-old Abigail Smith, his third cousin, whom he would marry on October 25th, 1764. They had 6 children, whose fate were mostly tragic. One was stillborn, one died at the age of 1 would drink himself to death at the age of 30, one would drink himself out of a career and then die of alcoholism. One died in her 40s from breast cancer after a horrible relationship with her husband, where they lived in a cabin on the land of a debtor's prison. And one, miraculously, became the 6th president of the United States. Adams gained notoriety for his opposition to the Stamp Act. On March 22nd, 1765, the British Parliament imposed a tax on the colonies to help pay for the war with France. This tax was imposed on all stamped paper, including playing cards and newspapers. He published multiple articles in newspapers under an assumed name opposing the Stamp Act. He would also be known as a lawyer who defended the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. All 8 of the soldiers were found not guilty of murder. One would be found guilty of manslaughter. His punishment was branding of the thumb. Adams was a representative in the First Continental Congress from September 5th, 1774 to October 26th, 1774. 12 out of 13 states were involved. Georgia was not involved because they were in a battle with Indian tribes and were fearful that the British would not assist them. Among other things, they drafted a letter to the king airing their grievances. They agreed to have a second Continental Congress after they received the response from King George III. On April 19th, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord occurred. The king rejected the grievances outright. On May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress began. Adams opposed any attempts at reconciliation with the British. At the convention, Washington was selected to lead the rebel forces. However, they still had not declared their formal independence from Britain. Adams was getting frustrated at the slow process. Finally, an agreement was made to declare their formal independence. Adams organized 5 people to draft the Declaration of Independence. He chose himself, Robert Livingston from New York, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, but it was Adams's passionate debates and political maneuvering that got it passed. Adams did not fight during the Continental War. He was on various committees in the Continental Congress to keep the troops funded and the government functioning. After that, he would spend much of his time overseas assisting Franklin in his negotiations with the French to get them to assist in our war. Adams taught himself French on a long journey to the continent. In 1780, he would become ambassador to the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic feared British retaliation and refused even to see Adams for 5 months. Adams would finally receive a loan from the Dutch. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed and the U.S. was granted independence. In 1785, Adams was sent to be ambassador to Britain. Adams returned to America in 1778. In 1789, he was elected our first vice president. As with virtually all vice presidents, his tenure was uneventful. He was chosen in part because Washington was a Southerner, so it was felt that it was best to have a Northerner for VP. He would be one of 3 VPs to cast more than 20 tie-breaking votes in the Senate. Kamala Harris has 33, John Calhoun has 31. He was not very active as vice president outside his tie-breaking votes and seldom attended cabinet meetings. In fairness, there was even less for a VP to do in the late 1700s than there is now. Adams would say of the vice presidency, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the intention of man contrived or in his imagination conceived." The election of 1796 was to be America's first contested election. It would also be the first election where political parties would be involved. By the time Washington left office, political parties had already formed. Hamilton's Federalist Party would back Adams. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican candidate. The Federalists wanted Adams to be president and Thomas Pinckney, the former governor of South Carolina, to be vice president. Pinckney was picked because the Federalists thought it might help with the Southern vote. The Democratic Republicans wanted Jefferson as president and Aaron Burr as vice president. Aaron Burr was a senator from New York, which they thought could help with the Northern vote. Aaron Burr and Hamilton disliked each other so intensely that Burr would end up shooting and killing Hamilton in a duel in New Jersey on July 11th, 1804. Hamilton didn't like Adams, so Hamilton tried to get the electors to vote for Pinckney, but it failed. Adams won with 71 electoral votes to become president, and Jefferson received 68 votes, making him the vice president. This would be the only election where the president was of one party and the vice president was of the opposite party. This was because there was a flaw in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 states each state electors would meet in their state and vote for 2 persons to be president, one whom cannot be from their state. It states nothing about the vice president. It wasn't until June 15th, 1804, with the 12th Amendment, that specifically clarified voting for the president and the vice president. Adams, after being elected, would keep Washington's cabinet, which was probably not the best idea since it was full of Hamiltonians who didn't like Adams. Adams would end up pretty much bypassing the cabinet at every opportunity. The overriding question was whether to support French in the Revolution. Jefferson wanted to support France. Probably most Americans at the time wanted to support the French. A few things would change this. The unrelenting violence which started to occur during the French Revolution. In addition, war started between France and Britain. And Jefferson didn't want to support Britain, whom we had just fought with. Jefferson was also always concerned that the Federalists just wanted to replace the English monarchy with an American monarchy. Another factor was the French began attacking our ships for trading with the British after the war between Britain and France began. Then there was the XYZ affair. Americans sent diplomats to France to negotiate a solution to the quasi war we were having with them over trading with the British. The diplomats representing France demanded bribes. It was not uncommon at the time. But this infuriated the Americans. But instead of giving out the French officials' names, they gave them the names X, Y, and Z, hence the XYZ affair. All the Americans would leave France in protest except Elbridge Gerry, who Gerrymandering was named after. He stayed in France trying to avert an all out war because America was in no position to fight at that time. He would eventually lay the groundwork for ending of military hostilities. The whole affair caused a fury in America. The Federalists controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency. They would use this and their current anger towards France to build up a navy and increase the size of the military. America in its early stage were always concerned about the possibility of a conflict with either Great Britain or some other European power since we had virtually disbanded our military. The Convention of 1800, which was ratified by Congress in 1801, would formally end the hostilities. One of the most controversial laws passed during the Adams tenure was the Alien and Sedition Acts. These acts were so unpopular it caused Adams and the Federalists to lose the presidency in both houses of Congress at the next election. These acts were done for three reasons. The first was in the anticipation of a war with France. They felt that these acts would help them deal with French sympathizers or French spies. The second, and more nefarious, was literally to suppress free speech. Adams, probably one of the smarter presidents we've had, distrusted the majority and to a lesser extent democracy if it meant the people were actually voting. The third main reason, again more nefarious, was that most of the immigrants tended to lean towards the Democratic Republican Party. The Alien and Sedition Acts would consist of four laws. The first, the Alien Friends Act. This allowed the president to imprison and deport non U.S. citizens who were determined to be a threat to the nation. This provision was automatically set to expire on March 3, 1801. The second, the Aliens Enemies Act. This allowed for the arrest, deportation, or relocation of any male over the age of 14 who hailed from a foreign country. The Democrat Republicans did not oppose this part of the act. The third was the Sedition Act. This act was notorious. This virtually prohibited public opposition to the federal government. It imposed fines and imprisonment against those who write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. Under this law, over 20 Democrat Republican newspaper editors were arrested, fined, and some imprisoned. A Vermont congressman, a U.S. congressman, was imprisoned for criticizing Adams. He was reelected, however, from his jail cell by the members of his district. The Naturalization Act. This extended the time it took to be naturalized in the United States from 5 to 14 years. Again, this was done because most immigrants favored the Democrat Republicans. This would be repealed in 1802. Again, these acts were done in anticipation of a war with the French. All these acts eventually either expired or were revoked, except for the Alien Enemies Act, which is still in effect today. It was updated in 1918 to include women. This act was used by President Monroe against the British in the War of 1812. Wilson used it in World War I, and FDR again in World War II. Largely due to these sedation acts, Adams would lose his re-election bid to Thomas Jefferson in 1800. Adams and Jefferson ended all communications between each other. The election will be covered in the next video under Thomas Jefferson. Adams would retire peacefully and attend to his farm. After over 12 years of not speaking to each other, Adams and Jefferson finally reconciled in 1812. On July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, Adams died. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Adams did not know that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. Adams was known as a stubborn and contentious fellow. The peaceful turnover of power to a rival party may have been his greatest accomplishment as president. Adams was one of only two presidents to have their son eventually become president, himself and President George H.W. Bush. John Adams' son was the sixth president, John Quincy Adams. George Bush's son was our 43rd president, George W. Bush. At the peak of his wealth, John Adams was worth approximately $25 million in today's currency and owned no slaves. John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, were the only two out of the first 12 presidents not to own slaves. Thanks for listening.